So on behalf of Eastern Oregon University, I would like to welcome everyone out today to this outstanding presentation being sponsored by our Center for Culturally Responsive Practice. And thanks to Tanya Lubis for arranging this, and a very great thank you to Dr. Gisela Ernst Slavit, who is with us today to present. She is from Washington State University, Vancouver. And as you can see, it looks like it'll be a great topic for us. And I'll turn some time over to Tanya to do a more formal introduction of our guest. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for being here. Here and online. We have folks online as well. So before I introduce her, at the end of the session, there'll be some times for questions and answers. If you do have a question, make sure that you hit the button on the mic on your table. Otherwise, it won't pick it up through the feed, and that will flash green when it's on. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Gisela Ernst Slavit, who comes to us, as Dan mentioned, from the Washington State University, Vancouver. She is a professor of education and ELL, teaches courses in sociolinguistics, literacy, biliteracy, and does a lot of research on second language teaching and learning, as well as ESL methods and critical issues in education of Latino students. She investigates language and education in culturally and linguistically diverse settings, and she primarily uses ethnographic research strategies and approaches. She's won multiple awards, has presented at the local, national, and international levels, and has many published works. I did a little research last night, and to date, her articles alone have been cited 1.7 thousand times. In 2002, she received, as part of a team, $1.3 million for ESL expansion for administrators in Washington. At the end of September of this year, she was just the primary investigator for a $2.2 million national grant to expand K-8 certification. She's a native of Peru, has presented in the United States, Canada, Japan, Pakistan, Peru, Spain, Thailand, and the Netherlands. And not only that, I consider her a personal friend. Many don't know this, but she was the chair of Carrie Wenger's dissertation committee and a mentor to her, and Carrie was at Eastern up until last year. She has mentored many of us in research and was actually co-published with me my very first article that I didn't do any writing in, but Carrie had mentored me as a paraprofessional in 2000 about how paraprofessionals are hidden teachers and the relationships that they have with students are important. So she continues to do that work. The $2.2 million that she just received is about grow your own paraprofessionals into bilingual and ESL educators. And today she's going to talk to us all about academic language, which is very pertinent to our campus and meeting the needs of our culturally and linguistically diverse students. So it's a real honor to introduce her, and please join me in welcoming her to EOU.
I'm just a faculty like you are, working hard and thanking you so much for coming on a Friday afternoon on a beautiful day. Thank you, Tanya, for all your work, for the Center for Culturally Responsive Pedagogy. Thank you to the Dean of the College of Education for having me here. And I'm not being heard.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had a wireless. Sorry.
So thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it.
I'm still picking up on it.
All right. So after that fantastic introduction, let me just start by telling you other parts. So I'm a second language learner. I grew up in Peru. So I still make some mistakes. English is my third language, so I often, instead of saying a sheet of paper, I have to think carefully because it comes out a little bit wrong. I love going to the Oregon coast. I love Seaside, Cannon Beach, Manzanita. But the word beach is also one that troubles me. Focus is another one. We use focus a lot in our writing, in our talking, and that comes out really bad. So just a disclaimer here that I might make mistakes, and like many of your students who are second, third, fourth language learners. So having said that, then let me talk about an important topic that is so pervasive right now in K-12 and also K-16 settings, academic language. We're academics, we know about it. But one thing is to know about it, but other is when it's hidden in plain sight. So this is kind of a rough agenda of what I'm going to do, and I say rough because I'm Peruvian, so we kind of are flexible and just kind of wonder sometimes depending on your interests as well. So talking a little bit about the hidden nature of academic language, the recent emphasis, I'm going to talk about diverse students, our diverse students, both in K-12 but also the college level, particularly Generation 1.5 students. And then how do we make this hidden academic language visible to our students? Because that's what the trick is. And we'll have time for questions and answers. Please, at any moment, interrupt me. If there are hard questions, just send them by email. If they're easy questions, I'll be glad to respond. All right. It is your first day in law school. It is now a requirement for every job, including professors. You show up to class and sit next to folks who have studied for many years and did well on a big law test to be there. As the professor starts talking, you recognize the words, but they do not mean what they usually do. And the sentences in the book take up half page. The professor asks a question, and 4 eager hands around you raise their hand. 4 people raise their hands. One person answers in long sentences and strange words. Another person adds something about previous court cases from 50 years ago. You raise your hand at a tense point in the discussion and ask to go to the restroom. Have you ever felt in that situation? Yeah? A little bit? Well, not in law school, but maybe in a different context. But that's how many of our students feel sometimes when they go into our classes. We're very knowledgeable of our content. We're very knowledgeable of the language for that content. But we sometimes don't realize that our students are not there. So in today's educational context, particularly as students in K-12 are, we're talking about Common Core standards, next generation science standards, academic language, becomes a capital, correct? It becomes something that if students don't have it, it's hard for them to invest it. It's a matter of access. So it's like the currency we need, or our students need, to be successful in our classes, in their programs. There are other capitals. Pierre Bourdieu talks about linguistic capital, cultural capitals, etc. So we're going to talk a little bit about academic language like a capital, something that if we have it, it makes us have access to the currency, to the classes that we're taking. Let me just give you an example about academic. Anyone from Chicago? Congratulations, go Cubs, go Cubs. I'm sorry?
I'm from Cleveland.
Okay.
May I go to the restroom?
All right. Well, we'll try to come back with something for Cleveland. But I just thought it was a timely piece of information, because when I came to the U.S., I knew nothing about baseball. Absolutely nothing. In Peru, we play football, which is soccer, and volleyball, and other things, but not baseball. So for me, I remember taking some tests, and it was about left field. And I was like, well, this is the left, this is the right. So for me, that, you know, baseball jargon was totally foreign to me. And I remember I was invited to a party and people were talking about the World Series. And I thought, oh wow, so there are different countries. Only to discover that the World Series is only the US and Canada. And it's like, that's a very small world from where I come from. My world is bigger. So that's, again, you know, that cultural, that historical understanding, that capital. I didn't have that capital in baseball. Now I'm a Mariners fan. I understand, you know, what an inning is, and I kind of watch it, and this year they didn't do too well. The thing about academic language is that it's hidden, it's not visible, it's not, we know when we see it, but it is not tangible or easy to teach, easy to learn. Expert language users, like you, know it. It makes sense when you see a text. But for our students, many of our students, particularly second language learners, particularly kids from different cultural backgrounds, it's not that clear. It's rather obscure. So, hidden in plain sight. Can you see that lovely picture? So why do we need to focus on academic language? Well, because it's part of the success. It's part of the key to success. It's the capital to gain a degree, to complete high school, because we have a much more diverse population than we used to. And because of social justice. And I'll just explain briefly each of them. So, anyone from linguistics? All right. So I can say a lot of things and you're not going to challenge me. No. So, academic language right now, it's a challenge for all students. So when I'm talking, my work is really in K-12 settings. All right? And I see students, whether they are native English speakers with parents who were born and raised in the US, they still are challenged by this academic language. In fact, let me tell you about my own children. So my husband is also a professor. He's in math and math education. So here we are, two professors in a household. We have two teenage boys. If you hear them talk, you wonder what hood are they growing up. It's just like, we have dinner every night together. We've had meals. We talk about the world, our day, and all that. Yet, when these kids are talking, not necessarily with us, but when we hear them kind of on the periphery, it's like, oh my God, you wouldn't know. So for all students, even those whose parents have a high level of education, you know, academic language is a challenge. And part of the challenge is that they only use it and hear in academic context. We'll talk a little bit about that in the future. So academic language is a challenge, it's a requirement for success. And more importantly, we are not making we're not making explicit how academic language looks in each of our disciplines. Because we are competent users of those characteristics, so we forget. We use them when we talk, we use them when we write, when we publish. And so for our students, it's like, huh? What is that? How is it that I can write like my professors want me to write? Diverse students. I don't need to talk about the changing demographics of Oregon, Eastern Oregon, or the United States. We are changing, and we are changing rapidly. It is predicted that by the year 2025, 1 of 4 students entering kindergarten might come from a household where English is not the home language. And that brings some great things, but also some challenges, especially when we talk about academic language. So when we talk about diverse students, we have all these different labels and different types of students. English learners can be, what's one label? English language learners, another label. But we have ESL students, which are mostly foreign students, correct? Like you have at Eastern Oregon. They come, from their countries to study, but that is a self-selected group. Because in order to come to study to this country, 1, they are on a scholarship, or 2, they have parents who can afford. And then there are other reasons, but those are the 2 primary reasons why we can have foreign students. So they are strong students already in their countries. They are strong speakers of their first language and often second and third language. Then we have, so those are ESL students. Then we have Generation 1.5 students, and I'll talk a little bit about them in detail. We have limited English proficient students. That was a label used by the government with No Child Left Behind. So that label we don't have to keep using it. But it refers to students who are learning English as a second language while in school. We have linguistic minority students. They can be Native American. They can be born in the U.S. And then recent arrivals. We also have speakers of different varieties of English. African American students who speak vernacular English or another variety. We have kids coming from California who speak a combination of Californian, English and Spanish, etc. So when we talk about then second language learners, it's not just a compact group. It's a very diverse group. Different strengths, different needs. So let me talk a little bit about Generation 1.5 students. You know about Generation 1.5 students? Yeah? So 1.5 students they are in between. They have characteristics of first generation immigrants and then second generation, meaning first generation, they are learning the language, in general. They're learning the culture there. Second generation, they already were born in the U.S. Their first language many times is English. And so, but Generation 1.5 students are in between. And let me tell you why they're in between. Oh, and they don't fit the category of non-native English speakers. So for example, at WSU, we have the support system for foreign students. This is in Pullman. A huge center. It's called International, I forgot something. But it's to support international students with their academic and language needs. Well, in Vancouver, we don't have that. But our students are not necessarily international. They are more the type of 1.5 students, Generation 1.5. More about Generation 1.5, educated mostly in the U.S., some born here. In FLOAT, that's an acronym we use in education that stands for Primary Home Language Other Than English. So at home, they speak another language. Some came to the U.S. in their teens, so finished high school, and then somehow some of them appear in our classes. Many have limited proficiency in their first language. And I'll explain in a little bit why. And they have limited academic language proficiency as well. Many of them have gone to school since preschool in the U.S. And yet they struggle with academic language. Why? Oh, I just thought I needed to add this visual. Generation 1.5 students include many parachute kids. And the literature talks about parachute kids as those who are living, for example, with relatives. Their family didn't come here. They came following an aunt, an uncle, and live in their homes. We have immigrants, written that way, because that refers to populations such as students from Puerto Rico. U.S. citizens, but their stronger language is Spanish. Have done schooling in English and Spanish, but Spanish keeps being the stronger one. Transitionals, students who come and go. In Vancouver, for example, we have a large population of Eastern European, mostly Ukrainians, who, not all of them, but some of them came because they were following their pastor's vision. But that vision included going to Vancouver and then going somewhere else, maybe back to Europe. So they were never, from the get-go, they were not feeling like this is the land where I'm going to stay. They were just transitioning somewhere else, which is different than, ooh, this is my country, I'm going to live here, I better learn everything I can, I'll try to be successful. And the term here that is a bit scary is that they are native born, meaning a group that is born in the U.S., but they are non-native speakers. Born and raised in the U.S., attended U.S. schools, and yet they still do not speak English as natives. They sound like it, but they don't have the control that some of our native students have. In many cases, the students, might declare that their dominant language is English. However, they may have, like I said, limited proficiency in their first language. L1 is first language. Very little academic literacy. And then they might be losing their first language. So, can you imagine the communication sometimes between kids who are speaking only a little bit of the family language and parents who speak only a little bit of English? So, again, going back to my teenage boys, communication is hard in whatever language we communicate with those kids. So can you imagine having those important conversations when the kid speaks only a little bit of the first language and the parent speaks only a little bit of English? In the literature also talks about some of our students being dual, non-native speakers because they don't thoroughly speak English, they don't thoroughly speak their first language. And here is kind of a summary of what I've been saying, but what I wanted to highlight here is that most of Generation 1.5 students, most of the ELL students that you have in your classrooms, in your classes, who may have been born in the U.S. or came when they were little, they sound fluent in English. They have all the mannerisms. They know the school system. Yet, they're called ear learners because they learn English from listening, not necessarily from writing, not necessarily from reading. Why? In some cases, they spoke their first language, their family language first, maybe learned to read in that first language, or enter school at a time when they were supposed to learn how to read and write in English. But their vocabulary, their ability to speak was limited, and so they got stuck there. Oops, sorry, I wanted to point that many of our ELLs and K-12 systems are often identify as needing this kind of support, a special education, so they are misplaced, misdiagnosed, and misplaced forever. So many of our students didn't have, the mainstream education that native English speakers have. And then they come into our classes. So for many of the students that I mentioned, academic language is hard to visualize. They speak English very well, but they just don't have those grammatical structures, the knowledge of the different genres that other students have. I said earlier that it's about social justice, and this is very applicable for K-12, but also for college level students. We have a system that is assessing students in things we're not teaching them. And Donaldo Macedo, who often comes to Oregon, by the way, particularly to the west side, to Portland, Donaldo Macedo talks about a pedagogy of entrapment. We bring students, we teach them something, we assess something else. We assume they know some things, but then when we assess them, they don't do very well. So it's about social justice. We need to pay attention to what is it that we're going to assess and make sure that we provide some of that. Now you might say, well, I'm not an English teacher. I teach history. I teach math. But still, we can provide some parameters. So in your class, content area?
Special education, also English.
English. Your area education.
English and
English. Here we have several English education. What about business? So in business, for example, yes, you're not an English teacher, but there's still jargon and ways of writing, ways of accessing information that become a critical capital for your students to be successful. So what is academic language then? I'm going to ask you just to spend 2 minutes with your partner, or just what is it, what's your own definition of academic language, very quickly, or your own understanding of academic language, okay? 2 minutes. You can talk.
yes.
What do you think? Yeah, exactly. That's what expression of more explicit, logical. Big words and long sentences. Lots of punctuation. Correctly.
It's outside of social usage.
And there's a lot of, like she said, was words. Just the words. I mean, academic words. But sometimes it's necessary to talk about certain. My problem with the I'm long examinations. They just want to
And now, people are have no patience. Now I'm just going to say, and you know, just all of us were in the 19th century.
Oh, yeah.
They almost need a translator. Just do.
So like when they are saying
Yeah.
It's been a while.
Yeah. You know, that's why look at it and be like, oh,
So that's what it is. It's read by a and knows as much as true. Not and he was an English teacher.
30 seconds.
And this is
All right.
right.
I heard some really lively discussion here, kind of happy hour type of discussion. Soon, or actually it's happy hour somewhere in the country. So who would like to share? What is, I heard interesting comments. What is happy hour? Happy hour.
And do hit your microphone if you interact.
Does he need, he's got it. Can you see that?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering, and we were talking, because I teach anatomy and physiology, and so when you're dealing with the science, that brings a whole nother level of terminology. So I was just sitting here thinking about if you have these students that are in transition between two different languages, and now we're trying to add in a third language to communicate in science, how much more difficult it is for them then to be able to get into a science, because now they're having to cross into a third language without knowing two very well. And so I was wondering if I mean, is that is an issue? Have you looked at that, or anybody looked at that? Because
Yes,
that's
and I will be talking a little bit later about some pieces of advice. Science is, so based on Greek and Latin roots. And many of our Spanish speakers do have quite a bit of knowledge, because some of the words that in English are academic, in Spanish are everyday words. And if they get to make the connection between the root or the affix on the word, and they are able to make that connection with what they know, everything will become much more accessible to them. But I'm going to go very specifically on that later on. So academic language in your field is, an incredible amount of scientific words and concepts, all of them connected to each other. So if you miss chapter 1, then chapter 2 is going to be very hard to understand. So, all right. So how do you see academic language in your disciplines, other disciplines? What do you understand academic language to be? Anyone?
Well, we talked about academic language in terms of the content area, but also the academy. So when students come, automatically we're like, oh, your syllabus, right? They might not know what a syllabus is, and so we're doing two things. So, and if you think of language development, you think of vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency. So we're kind of taking those next steps in that. But both types of vocabulary for the content, but then vocabulary for the academy, so they understand how we work as a system as well, because they're coming from a separate system of K-12.
So it's also vocabulary comprehension, but I'm understanding a little bit of the routines for the understanding school. So if you come to my class, look at the syllabus. Those are the rules. Those are the requirements. It's all there. But students sometimes don't look at the syllabus. They just don't like syllabi. So it's also habits of mind, habits, study habits. I work with mostly graduate students, but the last year or so I've been working with mostly undergraduate students. And so there's an orientation that happens when education students, when they are first admitted to the program, and it's orientation in groups of 8. And so the academic advisor meets with them and goes over the requirements, how the program will look for the 2 years of the duration of the program, what they need to do, the many assessments they need to pass along the way, because they are required by the state and other gods that require things. And one thing that I noticed right then is that most of the students had a planner, or they're on their phones, or their iPads, their tablets, or paper and pencil. There were 3 students in one group. The 3 of them were 2 Latino students, and one Samoan student. Those 3 kids didn't have anything to write, didn't have an iPad to record, or a calendar. So right then, because they are not even in the program, we have to work with the students. We have to help them realize that if you don't have a calendar, it's going to be very difficult. My youngest he has iPhones, iPads, no calendar. It's all in my head, Mom, I know. Of course, then he misses the deadline. So yeah, those habits of mind, so understanding of academia itself are very important. Who else wants to share their understanding of academic language or academic literacy in your different disciplines? Oh, there was a lot of talk.
Well, we talked a little bit about the logic of academic writing is different than social language. And I've noticed this for a long time, that people are not willing to commit themselves to a long, ordered, logical explanation. I'm not talking about kids, I'm talking about adults here, And it's just that sort of really systematic kind of thinking is academic, for sure. And it's not common or commonly practiced either.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
All professions have their jargon, and as does academia, and so that's just part of the way things work. Also think that not just the language used at a campus, but the structure of a campus itself is unusual, foreign to people who aren't familiar with the campus. So it's not on a grid. Buildings aren't labeled the way people expect buildings to be labeled. There's a whole vocabulary of the geography of a campus that you have to go through the process of learning. Strangers to the campus don't know it. It's like a code. And once you've learned it, you've become an initiate. You're an insider, and you can lord it over people who don't. So.
And that's the cultural capital, correct? That's the cultural capital.
Sure.
And first-generation college students, even the application forms can be so overwhelming. So the application form for a student who wants to enter WSU Vancouver's undergraduate education program, the application is 16 pages long. So You know, I was looking into that, it's like way to discourage someone. And it's not only the 16 pages, then they have to write this statement, they blah, blah, blah. So it becomes a huge thing. What a way of telling students, oh, this is too complicated. You don't have it here. It's very hard. In addition to that, we ask a million prerequisites. So anyway, boom. So academic language, any final thought? All right. So you will agree with me that academic language is not this. That thing is Mars. Okay, the one in red, I got this in an email from my student, an undergraduate student. Oh, dang, did I miss something important? Of course you did. If you don't come to my class, you missed something important. This stuff's kind of not right. I've heard this in my class. And then this was when one of my sons was in middle school. He was studying with some friends, and one of the friends said, Hitler invented the Nazis. Invented. So this is certainly not academic language, although it is how kids speak nowadays. So like we have said here, academic language resembles more written language. The language of school texts. It's the language of the disciplines. It's very different than everyday language. This is everyday language. It's the language of the assessments. I don't know in your disciplines how you have, but we have a bunch of assessments in education that are mandated. Some of them at the national level, not mandated at the national level, but we all commiserate because we have to take, our students have to take the same tests. And then it's the language associated with access, prestige, power, is that capital. It's called a register. In linguistic, we talk about not a cash register, although it might need a cash register if you have that language. But we call it a register because it's a specific jargon, someone mentioned, jargon in different ways of expressing information in our disciplines. Yeah.
I'm sorry to jump in, but I just thought of another example. I'm not an academic, so I'm just here provisionally. But the rank of professors and other types of instructors is something that, you know, if you want to be polite, you say, Professor so-and-so, but if that person's not a professor, is that an insult? You know, so this is another way. Or is it an insult to the full professor who say, hey, that person's not a professor? So that's another piece of it.
In sociolinguistics, terms of endearment or terms of address are key because they provide access. You should hear when our kids are asking for money, how polite they can be. It's often associated with a purpose, and some of our students don't have that capital. So when they ask for things, for information, or sometimes they don't even know how to ask for information. I remember I had a high school student. Do we all know what we need to do for tomorrow? Do you know what we need to do for tomorrow? And my student would say, no problem, teacher, no problem. Next day, no homework. Following day, you know what you have to do tonight?
No problem.
You know. Next day, no homework. What this student had learned was that everyday language to shoo, teacher. Don't. But he really didn't understand, and I didn't give him the opportunity to ask. Because my question was, everyone knows what's due tomorrow? So who is going to say, excuse me, I didn't understand most of what you said today. So I wasn't giving him a chance to ask for a specific question. My question was global and kind of like, move on. So a register is a particular jargon, the particular way of speaking. When you get a new credit card, for example, you get that long font 5 paper with a lot of legalese language and economics, and you start reading, and you read it again, and then you sign it. Because really you're not understanding and you're trusting that the credit card company is doing the right thing. That's a register. Can we identify academic language? Of course we can. We can. Sometimes our students can. Can we determine the specifics? Probably not. And let me go fast. I'm looking at the clock here. So everyday versus academic language. Can you look at these two excerpts and tell me which one is more academic than the other? Which one is more academic than the other? Any volunteers?
The right side. I'm speaking on behalf.
Concern has been expressed over the possible detonation of a nuclear device which could result in widespread mortality. Very timely too, huh? So yeah, this is more academic. Does everyone agree? Everyone? Yeah? Yeah?
Well, it's not very good writing style. It's in the passive. You know, I think your English instructors would say that's not very good.
But passive language is what we use in a lot of academic. I always think about scientists who are so passionate about their research, about their findings, and yet all the texts in science are written in passive voice. It was discovered. So yes, the one on the right might not be that well written, but it's more academic, correct? Why? For a lot of reasons. Instead of writing in first person, I am worried, it's that detached stance, that passive voice. It's densely packed. Now look at this last sentence here. Well, it's a whole sentence, a long sentence, but look, old information, nuclear device which could result in widespread mortality. And nominalizations. Instead of verbs, we make them nouns. Instead of saying, we fought, it's the fight. Everything is a noun, and therefore it's detached, again, from the doing, the activity, which is what kids think in terms. Academic language is developmental, and I want to highlight this because it's not like you have it and you don't. You learn it along the way. In fact, in K-12 settings, we talk about, well, what is an academic expression in first grade is no longer academic in fifth grade. It becomes everyday language, correct? So this is the work that Margot and I have been doing for many years, is how to then make it visible to everyone. For teachers, for instructors, how do we make academic language visible so students can learn it? Because if we don't provide, we just say this is how it's written or this is an example, how did we learn to write academically ourselves? How did we learn to use academic language in our speech? So most times when we talk about academic language, people think about vocabulary, the jargon, the words, the terms. But that's part of it. That's part of it. J. Lemke, a physicist turned high school teacher and then a sociolinguist, he said something along this terms. To do science, you need to speak the language of science. Not just the words, but the language. You need to be able to understand a problem. And sometimes it is in the writing and the sketching that you understand it. And it's not just vocabulary. So in our work, when we talk about academic language, we try to kind of use this construct along 3 dimensions. Discourse, academic language at the grammatical or sentence level, and then words, phrases. Let me explain a little bit more how this looks. Word expression level. Vocabulary, phrases, the jargon. Can you see okay? It's kind of small here, but this is a great room. You have special monitors everywhere. At the discourse level, what we are referring are the different genres that students need to know how to access and produce. So they go to your, what is it, neuroanatomy or what?
Just anatomy.
Anatomy. So they go to your class, do they go to labs too? Okay. So they go to your class and they have to write a lab report. Then they go to your English class and they have to write a book report. They're reports. But the rules, the format, the content of both reports are going to be different. But students think, oh, report, it should be the same. And we many times assume that they should know that because they've been, so many years in school. But they might have not learned. They might have filled in science classes, unfortunately, they might have just filled a worksheet and they didn't really think through. So those are that's why genres and different kinds of discourse, the different chunks of language the students need to learn to write, which are different in each discipline. At the sentence level, it's how do we put words in sentences that make sense? Someone earlier, when we talked about academic language, said long sentences. Well, yeah, we use a lot of long sentences, and the information is there, but students might miss it. And I'll show you some examples how students might miss them. So this is, in a nutshell, kind of our construct in terms of how to access, make visible, how to access academic language and make it visible. I have examples here at the K-12 level, so forgive me, but they apply also to the disciplines. So for example, at the discourse level, we have chunks of language that follow their own rules, like autobiographies, lab reports, story problems, pervasive in mathematics. At the sentence level, sequence words. First, second, third, next, finally. Logical connectors. However, in spite, thus. Those are those little words that change and give kind of style to what we're writing. Complex noun phrases. We keep adding in English words to mean something. So for example, nuclear energy waste. It's just like, and then we have 4 or 5 words. And so if students miss one of those words, or if they want to look at it in the dictionary, it doesn't make sense because it's together that means something. And then of course the different vocabulary. So let me share with you this little piece of an excerpt from a 10th grade book, History. I'll give you a couple of minutes to read it. So there's information is packed there. Look, for example, here. These leaders use Enlightenment ideas. Whoa, that's a big, that means a lot, correct? But how do we help students access this text, and also how do we help them understand the different characteristics of academic language? So, for example, we can think about, okay, this is very authoritative. This is how it is. This is how they did it. we can also think about other aspects. Can you think about other aspects that make this text academic? Yeah.
I think that's more effectively academic than the example about the concerns, et cetera, the bomb, because that other example does not show students that writing concisely is also an important part of effective writing, which comes from critical thinking.
Correct.
And so that example seemed to me to be more of a journalistic manipulation to kind of diffuse the focus of a real concern.
Okay.
Whereas this is concise. The sentences don't have to be extra long with lots of strange punctuation or hyperbole.
Okay.
So I think that critical thinking is what should be underlying academic language, and I have a little problem with that first example of academic language. I really wouldn't want to intimidate my students with that as an example of what they're aiming for.
Correct, and that's not all. That's a beginning to make it visible.
Right.
I will move to academic language not being just looking at the language part, but it's the ability to think, to speak, to have those habits of mind, to think critically, to think outside the box. But we'll get there in a minute. I just wanted to look. So if we can make the writing visible, what makes academic writing visible to them, they can start working on that. So I just had some aspects here of academic language that are often the ones that trouble students, particularly second language learners. So for example, we have this, never mind, but the reference chains, that's what I was, where we use different terms for the same character, so to speak. You see there, we have the leaders, a tyrant, etc., etc. So we are using the different terms, and when students sometimes trip on one of them, they might not be able to connect. Or if they write, then they repeat the same word, and we say, no, repetitive. But sometimes they are not understanding why. We are talking about the Revolutionary War. We're talking about why are we repeating revolutionary, revolution? I have to repeat it, but they don't know how to use a different way of expressing that. So let me, and of course densely packed information. But so I wanted to highlight that if we just work on jargon, we just talked about vocabulary, we are giving the students only a pile of bricks. And a pile of bricks, it costs money, there's good capital, but you cannot do much with them. If we help them understand how to put those words together in ways that make meaningful sentences, it's like we're allowing students to build a wall. Not that wall, but just build a wall that is solid. But a wall alone doesn't protect us, correct? We have to think about the structure, how you put those sentences together to make the genre that is appropriate to your book report and to your lab report. And here's where I'm addressing your point that academic language, that part is just a key, a way of realizing what students need to really use language to be scientists, to be accountants, to be English teachers, to be special ed teachers, biologists, etc. It's just one of the many aspects of their discipline, but it's one that we can deconstruct for them so they can understand. Why do students fail to acquire academic language? Because we model it without being explicit about it. And I know your job is not to teach language to your students, but you have to make it visible. You don't have to teach it, but you have to make it visible. And I will talk a little bit about how we are doing that at WSU. I'm going to skip that. On my six suggestions for practice. And then we'll have time for questions and reactions and concerns and complaints. First of all, make visible the academic language demands in the text. Students have to access. By text, I mean textbooks, articles, online material. In the tests, Jeff Swires talks about the 4 T's. The text, the tests or the assessments, the task we give students. So we lecture on something orally, on a topic, and then we ask students to write something in a format that we didn't talk about during our lecture. And we're expecting them to know that. So providing models there, examples, etc., might be very helpful. And in the talk. In K-12 settings, often teachers are not modeling academic language in their talk. Their talk is much more casual, engaging, using everyday language. But then students are expected to write using academic language. And as students, all our students, including yours, if they don't use the language orally, it's going to be very hard for them to put it into writing, correct? This is an example from a high school. One of my students, as he was leaving, just before the bell rang, says, "Write a legend about shooting stars," and left. So next day he was expecting, an example like this, writing about the shooting stars, this kind of star. Instead, they had written about Klay Thompson, former WSU player, about LeBron, Steph Curry, etc. So clarity in what we are assigning students is very important. Again, it has to do with, we expect our students to be able to understand what we're saying, but there might be that disconnects. Make visible the differences between oral and written language, and this is huge. In the past, it was easier for me to identify the difference between oral and written. Not anymore, because kids text all the time. And the way they're using language in social media is it's written. They're typing with their fingers, even they are not even looking, and they can do that. But it's different, and that translates into the writing. Have you worked with deaf students, for example, or you're familiar with deaf culture? You know that ASL, for example, is American Sign Language. But the way it's written, the way it's spoken, doesn't follow the rules of spoken English. And so the students have a ton of problems then trying to write in a way that corresponds to the English, the oral English, not even academic. So this is how students sometimes forget, and then they send an email to us or a request, and it's written like that. This is a email sent by an 11th grader. "Hello, Miss, it's Cody from 3rd grade period, and turn it in, won't accept my essay," and I'll let you read it.
It would only start with dude, it would just,
Again, this is how they are communicating. Kids, young fellows, and I call them kids, but I have, some that are 20-something, and they still are using this. Not to me, because they have learned some, but at the early stages. So then you can also write to them. The point is that we have to make visible the differences between oral and written language before we can even get to the academic part. Use visuals. This is very important, especially if you have Spanish-speaking students, because you might be using a lot of terminology that they understand if they have a visual. So for example, if I say eufemístico, if you speak Spanish, they'll say, what does eufemístico mean? Euphemism. If I say, anyway, it doesn't matter. I can say a lot of words that, edificio. Edifice, okay. Anyway, I'm trying to provide examples in, I can do this. I can do this because I have the other laptop. Be patient, please. Remember, keep calm and listen carefully. Okay, I'm going to read this for you. Okay, if you speak Spanish, then don't participate, just listen. Somos parte del universo. Los científicos han calculado, I can't see, okay. Los científicos han calculado que en el universo puede haber más de 100,000 millones de galaxias, todas reunidas en grupos reconocibles o cúmulos. La Vía Láctea forma parte de un conjunto de 30 galaxias, el llamado grupo local. What am I talking about?
Galaxies.
Galaxies, what else?
Distance between galaxies, maybe. I heard mileage in there.
Okay,
So,
all right. Okay. Now, let me show you what I just read.
Number of galaxies in the local group, talking about the universe.
Do you speak Spanish?
No.
Right. So you can get it.
So it's the Via Láctea, it's going to be the Milky Way.
There are so many cognates between English and Spanish, particularly in terms of scientific words. So if you are talking about something and you just have your PowerPoint packed with information, it's not pedagogical, but it will be helpful for your students because they can understand many of the words because they look alike, but they don't sound alike. You see what I'm saying? There are many, okay, I'll stop there about the cognates. So you get the idea how scientific, because Spanish is based on Latin, the Latin roots that are in Greek, that are the kind of the thick of the, conform the thick of scientific language. It's right there. Wait time. Research suggests that most educators ask a question and give less than a second or a second before a student is picked. And wait time is very important for all our students, but particularly to students whose first language might not be English. They need percolation time, just like good tea and good coffee. And I monitor myself because I video record myself every so often with my students so we can analyze my videotape. It's horrific, by the way. But it models what they can do and will do later on. And I realize I try to be very cognizant about wait time, but sometimes it's easier just to go. And one thing that we do is we ask that question, nobody answers, so we answer it ourselves. Don't we do that? And that doesn't allow students for deeper thinking, for critical thinking. Use rubrics for the writing. So this is one example. WSU has a Center for Teaching and Learning, and they have developed a lot of rubrics and support systems. And I use rubrics now with my students as detailed as they can be. In the first paper they give me, I am mean. I use my pencil and just mark little things, big things, everything. But I give them a rubric. And I said, this is what I'm going to be looking at your writing. And so then they, next time when they do the same assignment or similar, I ask them for a thesis paper, just a one-pager, 2-pager. And so next time they really pay attention to those details because I'm explaining why. But then the second, third, fourth paper, I don't need to do that detailed editing because they already have done it themselves by having the rubric. I also suggest have a peer read it, have a parent, have someone take a look. I don't know if you use OWL. Yeah, I hear. Remind students of support systems. There are universities that have a lot of support for our students. My campus in Vancouver has the writing lab that is not too helpful because a lot of the helpers in the writing lab are kids who are not doing very well in their English class, and to get extra credit, they're supposed to be helping others. So I have issues with my writing lab, but if you have a good one here, use it. But if you don't, there are online resources like OWL is from Purdue University. I know someone uses this here. They have little tips, little lessons, and so I say when I see some feature like there's transitions or I said, look, go to OWL, they have a section on this, read it. And there are exercises and they get it. Charles Darwin University, just go to this website. They have tons of little lessons, videos, that will help your students get some of the things we don't have time to explain because you have to teach business, because you have to teach anatomy, because you have to teach special ed. Time for questions. Thank you. Any questions, complaints, concerns? Listen, it's very difficult to talk about academic language for all the disciplines to academics like yourselves. So the main message here is making visible some of those obscure traits that characterize the language of our disciplines. And those traits that the students are going to be assessing. The difference between when I read a paper from a student who is a good writer and the student who is a struggling writer, I forget sometimes to focus on the ideas, on the content, because it's just sometimes very bothersome to see them not being able to control their writing. And so that's why it's an issue of social justice, helping them learn what is a skill. It has nothing to do with their ability or their thinking or the information they have about content. It's a skill. So, thank you. Oh, I guess thank you because you can ask questions or go to happy hour. Yes.
So then do you think it would be fairer to be assessing just those ideas initially and then look at the structures?
That's a great question because we can give students a chance by saying your ideas are great. This time I'm going to grade you on your ideas and how you are thinking about this. But in the future, use this rubric to guide the format of the content you're expressing. So yeah, in K-12 we do a lot of adjustments because otherwise our students will always be failing, correct? And you see a lot of progress in some students.
Have you read Vine Deloria, the guy from Colorado, Power and Place? It's about Native American education and the different viewpoints. The worldview is what's really different, and that affects the language. And it goes back and forth. They both affect each other. But he really lays it out. He shows the almost unbridgeable gap between the worldviews of the culture.
Yeah, and for example, along those lines in history, when you're working with Native Americans or Asian students, they don't see the history as linear like we see it. They see it in terms of eras, in terms of dynasties.
That's right.
And so when we ask the students to produce, a linear display, it's like, well, it's complicated because this one is connected to that one, and
yeah. And he talks about how in our culture we divide like lizards. We group all them together based on anatomy. But in the Native American tradition, it's the specific animal in relation to its environment and its neighbors. So it's all about the web of life, and an organism is defined by how it fits within that community and not by its morphology.
And that brings also a point, thank you, this is because writing itself is culturally based. I come from a place where the more words you use to say something, the better you are, the flowery language. We use the we instead of it's me writing, but we use we believe, and it's my paper. And so those differences are fundamental in terms of, whether in English is concise language. To the point. Your 5-paragraph essay starts with mentioning the idea. The first sentence has to be, what is this paragraph about? Well, in Spanish is you come back at the end with a punchline. So all those aspects, we have to make them visible. We are trying to do that in the K-12. And so if students come with some of that obscure way of writing, it might be a cultural, and just bringing it up might be helpful. Any other questions? Yes.
More of a comment just generated as the discussion is going on now about students coming in from another language and culture, especially the young ones, and they are trying so hard to adapt to their peers. And so the Native
Native English speaker?
English speaker from this country, the culture of, for example, all those texting inabilities to write sentences with letters and words, and various cultural, overly casual, not considerate, respectful things. So students who are trying to assimilate while they're going to school, they have language and culture already as a huge bridge to cover. They feel like that they're getting somewhere because they're getting in there with their dorm mates, and they don't know the academic language either, but they're native English speakers. So the newcomers are thinking that those are their models.
Yeah.
And so we have this multiple layer of complexity of trying to adjust into this dialect, which will be this invaluable tool for them eventually. But it seems like that I can imagine them feeling like that we are undermining their cultural assimilation in the act.
That's an excellent point. Researchers, you mentioned the gentleman in front of you, the anatomy professor said, it's like a third language, and it is a third language. And for our second language learners, they are learning everyday language very fast, and they want to be like any other kid. They want to wear the same shoes, the same pants. They want to speak like them, and that's the issue. How do we provide models? And that's why modeling and providing examples, I struggle with that one, because if I provide an example, then my students want to do exactly the same thing. And so I try to select a variety of very different possibilities so they can find their own way. And then one other thing that I do is I don't keep them, those examples of assignments, I don't keep them long on Blackboard. I just show them and then take them away so they don't use it as a crutch. But at first, I want them to at least start, with some models. Thank you for your very insightful comments. I'm sorry?
I never thought of taking the samples down so that they have it to review and understand it, but it's not there to.
Always.
Yeah.
I don't tell them that. I said, I leave the example for a while, and so their first paper might be very similar, and then I just take them away because, or I pass examples on hard copies during the class and not post them, so they can't copy. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Tanya, and happy hour.
All right, we do have some evals feedback that we'd like you to fill out, those orange sheets, or salmon, I guess is the actual color. If you could fill those out and give them back to Kristen or myself, or just set them on the table. There are plenty of refreshments left, so do help yourselves to those. And then we do have a couple door prizes here. So the winner of this is Sarah Ralston. You get the full packet. You're the #1 winner here. So you get some Post-its and the book, autographed book. She has a message for you in there.